June 19, 1944. In 8 hours, American pilots shot down 350 Japanese aircraft. The exchange ratio was 13 to 1. Some say it reached as high as 19 to 1. This was not just a battle. This was not merely a victory. This was the single day when Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as a fighting force. And it started with one young American pilot who had learned to transform defeat into the deadliest lesson the enemy would ever face. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly beneath a tropical sun. Somewhere in that vast blue emptiness, 200 miles west of the Mariana Islands, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of the carrier Taiho. He watched his strike force launch into the morning sky. 300 carrier aircraft climbed toward the American fleet to the east. The sound of radial engines filled the air. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt spray. Ozawa turned to his operations officer. His voice carried absolute confidence. "The Americans cannot withstand this assault," he said. "Their pilots lack discipline. Their tactics are crude. By sunset, we will control these waters." He had every reason for certainty. He commanded 9 carriers, 473 aircraft. His pilots had trained for 2 years minimum before earning carrier qualification. Japanese naval aviation had opened the Pacific War by devastating Pearl Harbor. They had sunk the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse in a single afternoon. They had dominated Pacific skies for 18 months, while America scrambled to learn the basics of carrier warfare. Ozawa's intelligence officers had assured him the American task force possessed only 7 carriers. The numbers favored Japan. The experience favored Japan. History itself seemed to favor Japan. What Ozawa did not know would kill 445 of his pilots before the sun set. 300 miles to the east aboard the carrier, Lexington Lieutenant Alexander Vrashew sat in the ready room. 24 years old, 87 combat missions behind him, 12 confirmed kills to his name. He cleaned the firing mechanisms of his 50 caliber machine guns with methodical precision. Each round had to feed perfectly. Each gun had to fire without hesitation. Lives depended on mechanical perfection. A young ensign sat beside him, James Sullivan, 22 years old. 6 months ago, Sullivan had been working his family's farm in Iowa. Now he wore the wings of a naval aviator and tried not to show how terrified he was. "Mr. Vrashew," Sullivan asked quietly, "what if I freeze up there?" Vrashew looked at the kid. He saw himself 2 years earlier, scared, untested, flying into the chaos of the Coral Sea where Japanese Zeros tore through American formations like sharks through a school of fish. He remembered his wingman, Lieutenant Bob Henderson from Ohio, 26 years old, married 6 months, dead because American doctrine demanded rigid formations and the Japanese doctrine demanded only victory. "Then I will drag you home myself," Vrashew said. The ready room speaker crackled. "All pilots to flight stations. Japanese fleet spotted 200 miles west. This is not a drill." Sullivan's hands shook as he gathered his gear. "Stay on my wing," Vrashew told him. "Do exactly what I say. We both come home." "Deal," Sullivan nodded. He could not speak. Somewhere between the two fleets, the gap closed. Ozawa's strike force flew east. American radar operators watched green blips appear on their screens at 150 miles. The Japanese pilots believed they were approaching an unprepared enemy. They believed surprise remained on their side. They believed their codes were unbreakable and their approach undetected. They believed wrong. For 2 years, American crypt analysts had been reading every Japanese naval message, every order Ozawa issued, every movement his fleet made, every briefing his commanders gave. All of it landed on Admiral Raymond Spruance's desk within hours, sometimes within minutes. Spruance stood in the flag plot aboard his flagship. He studied the decoded Japanese battle plan. The enemy expected 7 American carriers. Spruance commanded 15. The enemy estimated 300 American fighters. Spruance would launch 475. The Japanese assumed American technology remained static frozen at 1942 levels. American factories had been busy. Spruance turned to his fighter director officer. "Position intercept groups 50 miles forward of the fleet," he ordered. "Vector them to altitude advantage. Let them know exactly where the enemy is coming from and exactly when they will arrive." The officer acknowledged and began issuing precise coordinates to circling Hellcat fighters. This was new. This was what 2 years of painful learning had built. An integrated air defense system the Japanese did not know existed. Radar that could see enemy formations 100 miles away. Radio communications that allowed fighter directors to position defending aircraft with mathematical precision. Training that had transformed average American kids into disciplined combat pilots. The Japanese had opened the war with veteran pilots flying superior aircraft using proven tactics. They had massacred American forces at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines. They had every reason to believe they would do so again. But wars are not won by those who start strong. Wars are won by those who learn fast. Aboard Lexington, Vrashew climbed into his Hellcat's cockpit. The aircraft represented everything America had learned from 2 years of defeat. Where the Japanese Zero weighed 6,000 pounds and relied on maneuverability, the Hellcat weighed 15,000 pounds and dominated through speed firepower and pilot protection. 650 caliber machine guns could fire 4,800 rounds per minute combined. Armor plating protected the pilot and fuel tanks. A 2,000 horsepower engine generated speeds the Zero could never match. The Japanese had trained their pilots to outturn opponents in traditional dogfights. Americans had trained their pilots to refuse those dogfights entirely. Dive on the enemy at 400 miles per hour. Fire. Extend away at full throttle. Climb back to altitude. Repeat. Never turn with a Zero. Never get slow. Never give the enemy the fight he wanted. Speed is life, Vrashew's instructors had drilled into him. Altitude is life insurance. Turning with a Zero is suicide. The Hellcat's engine roared to life. Vrashew ran through his checklist with the muscle memory of 87 previous missions. Sullivan's aircraft sat on the catapult beside him. The kid was going through his own checks, trying to remember everything, trying not to think about dying. The catapult officer gave the signal. Vrashew's Hellcat hurtled down the deck and into the morning air. Sullivan followed seconds later. They joined the combat air patrol circling at 15,000 feet. 40 Hellcats, positioned exactly where radar predicted the Japanese would appear, waiting with altitude advantage in the sun behind them. The Japanese flew into a trap they could not see. Lieutenant Vrashew, the fighter director's voice came through his headset. Vampire inbound bearing 265 Angels, 18 many bogeys. Vrashew banked west and advanced his throttle to maximum power. His division climbed through 15,000 feet toward 18,000. Below, the fleet's anti-aircraft guns remained silent. Tracking targets. Waiting. This was new doctrine too. Fighters engaged first, guns fired second. No more friendly fire casualties from nervous gunners shooting at anything airborne. The integration was complete. The system was ready. The Japanese were coming. At 10:42 hours on the morning of June 19th, Alexander Vrashew spotted them. 18 Yokosuka D-4Y. Judy dive bombers in stepped formation at 18,000 feet, heading straight toward the American carriers. No Zero escorts visible. Either they had become separated during the flight, or Ozawa had launched bombers without adequate fighter protection. It did not matter. The result would be the same. Mr. Vrashew armed his guns. He positioned his division 2,000 feet above and behind the Japanese formation. Sullivan held perfect position on his wing. The kid was doing everything right, following orders, maintaining formation discipline, not panicking. All units, Vrashew transmitted, weapons hot. Here they come. This was the moment 2 years of development had prepared for. The moment when American adaptation met Japanese assumption. When systematic learning confronted static doctrine. When the students became teachers and the lesson would be written in fire across the Pacific sky. The moment had arrived. But to understand how this moment became possible, we must go back 2 years. May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrashew flew his first major combat mission against the Japanese. He watched his squadron get torn apart by Zero fighters that moved like nothing he had ever seen. The Americans flew rigid formations the way peacetime doctrine demanded. 3 plain V shapes, predictable, inflexible. The Japanese flew in flexible 2-plane elements. They slashed through American ranks. They picked off stragglers. They disappeared into clouds and reappeared behind formations that could not adapt fast enough. Vrashew's wingman died in that battle. Lieutenant Bob Henderson, 26 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, married to his high school sweetheart 6 months earlier. He died because American doctrine said never break formation and Japanese doctrine said do whatever wins. Henderson's fighter took cannon fire from a Zero that appeared from nowhere. The aircraft exploded. No parachute, no time. One moment Henderson was on Vrachew's wing. The next moment he was gone. Just smoke and debris falling into the Coral Sea. Vrachew survived with shrapnel wounds and a burning question. Why did we lose? He spent 6 months recovering in Hawaii, 6 months reading after action reports, 6 months talking to pilots who had survived Coral Sea and Midway and the early battles of Guadalcanal. The answer became clear. Americans were fighting a 1942 war with 1941 thinking. The Japanese had evolved. American doctrine had not. When Vrachew returned to flight status, he requested assignment to Training Command. He wanted to teach new pilots what he had learned. The Navy needed experienced combat pilots on the line, but they needed instructors more. Too many young pilots were dying in their first combat because nobody had taught them how the Japanese actually fought. For 6 months, Vrachew drilled replacement pilots on the tactics that kept him alive. Forget the peacetime formations. Fly in pairs. Give each other mutual support. Never turn with a Zero. Use speed and altitude. Dive. Shoot. Extend. Climb. Repeat. The Zero is more maneuverable, but the Hellcat is faster and tougher. Use your strengths. Avoid their strengths. Win by not fighting the enemy's fight. He made every student write a letter to their families before their first combat deployment. He made them seal the letters and give them to a friend to mail if they did not return. He wanted them to understand what failure meant, not abstract tactical defeat. Real death, real families receiving telegrams, real widows like Bob Henderson's wife who would never see their husbands again. He made a promise to Bob's widow in a letter he sent from Hawaii. No more Americans would die because they refused to learn. No more rigid adherence to doctrine that got men killed. No more pretending the old ways still worked. Now in June 1944, Vrachew was back with Fighting Squadron 16 aboard Lexington. The training tour was over. Combat operations had resumed. He had 12 kills. He was about to get 6 more in a single mission. But first he had to keep Jimmy Sullivan alive. The American military had changed in 2 years. Not just tactics, not just aircraft. Everything. The entire system of how the Navy fought carrier battles had been rebuilt from the bottom up. Leaders who could not adapt had been replaced. Doctrine that failed had been discarded. Technology that did not work had been improved or abandoned. The F-6F Hellcat represented that transformation in aluminum and steel. Grumman Aircraft had studied every combat report from the Pacific. They had interviewed pilots. They had examined damaged aircraft. They had asked one fundamental question: what does a pilot need to survive against a Zero and kill it? The answer was not maneuverability. The Zero would always outturn a heavier American fighter. The answer was not rate of climb. The Zero's lightweight gave it superior climb performance. The answer was speed, firepower, and protection. The Hellcat could dive faster than a Zero could follow. It could extend away in level flight faster than a Zero could chase. Its .650 caliber machine guns could destroy an enemy aircraft with a 2-second burst. Its armor could absorb punishment that would shred a Zero's unprotected airframe. American pilots learned to use these advantages with ruthless efficiency. No more dogfighting. No more trying to outturn the enemy. That was fighting the enemy's fight. The new doctrine was simple. Use altitude to position above the enemy. Dive at 400 miles per hour. Fire. Extend away before the enemy can react. Climb back to altitude using superior speed. Repeat until the enemy is dead or retreating. It was not glamorous. It was not the romantic vision of aerial combat that movies portrayed. It was systematic, methodical, and it worked. Radar had transformed carrier defense. In 1942, American carriers had relied on visual spotting and pure luck. Fighters circled randomly, hoping to intercept enemy strikes. Coordination was minimal. Communication was chaos. The Japanese exploited these weaknesses mercilessly. By 1944, every American carrier task group had fighter director officers who studied radar screens and controlled defending fighters by radio. They could see Japanese formations while still 100 miles away. They could calculate course altitude and speed. They could position intercept groups with mathematical precision. The Japanese still flew toward what they thought were surprised, unprepared defenders. They had no idea they were being tracked from the moment they left their carriers. They had no idea American fighters were being vectored to perfect intercept positions. They had no idea the trap was already set. This integration of technology, tactics, and training represented America's true advantage. Not just better aircraft, not just more resources, better systems, faster adaptation, ruthless willingness to learn from failure. Aboard Lexington's Ready Room, Ensign James Sullivan had listened to Vrashu's lectures during training. Stay on your leader's wing. Maintain formation discipline. Do not chase kills into bad positions. Do not turn with zeros. Follow the doctrine. Trust the system. Come home alive. Sullivan was 22. He had grown up on a corn farm outside Des Moines. He had never seen the ocean until Navy flight training. 6 months ago, he had been driving tractors and worrying about crop prices. Now he sat in a carrier ready room preparing to fly combat against the Japanese Navy. His hands shook as he checked his flight gear. He tried to hide it. Everyone else seemed calm. Vrashu sat nearby, methodically cleaning gun parts. Other pilots played cards. Some slept. How could they sleep? In a few hours they might be dead. Sullivan thought about his father's words when he had left Iowa. Do your duty, his father had said. Come home with honor. Make us proud. He intended to do all three. He just did not know if he could. Vrashu noticed the kids shaking hands. He had seen it before. Every new pilot carried that fear. The ones who survived learned to function through it. The ones who did not survive usually froze at the wrong moment. First combat is always the hardest, Vrashu told him. You know what kept me alive at Coral Sea? Your skills, Sir Sullivan asked. Vrashu shook his head. Luck. And a wingman who followed orders. You do that tomorrow and we both come home. Deal, Sullivan nodded. He could not trust his voice to speak. The ready room speaker crackled. All pilots stand by for launch operations. Enemy fleet located 200 miles west. Strike groups launching at 0900 hours. Sullivan's stomach tightened. This was real. This was happening. In minutes, he would be in his aircraft. In an hour, he would be in combat. Everything he had trained for was about to be tested. Vrashu stood and gathered his gear. He looked at Sullivan. Remember what I taught you. Stay on my wing. Watch your altitude. Conserve your ammunition. Do not chase. Come home. Yes, Sir, Sullivan managed. They walked together to the flight deck. The morning sun blazed across the Pacific. The ocean stretched endless and blue in every direction. Lexington's deck bustled with organized chaos. Aircraft handlers positioned planes for launch. Ordnance crews loaded ammunition. Fuel crews topped off tanks. Sullivan's Hellcat sat ready on the catapult. He climbed into the cockpit and strapped in. The seat felt too big. The controls seemed too many. He ran through the checklist his instructors had drilled into him. Fuel selector, mixture rich, propeller full forward, magnetos on, battery on, primer. He hit the starter. The R2800 engine coughed once and roared to life. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower. The aircraft vibrated with contained power. Vrashu's Hellcat launched first. The catapult hurled 7 tons of aircraft into the air in 3 seconds. Sullivan watched his leader climb away. Then it was his turn. The catapult officer gave the signal. Sullivan pushed his throttle to maximum. The catapult fired. The acceleration pressed him back into his seat. 3 seconds of crushing force, and then sudden freedom as the aircraft left the deck and climbed into tropical air. He joined on Vrashu's wing. They circled while the rest of the division launched. 4 aircraft total, Vrashu leading, Sullivan on his wing, 2 more Hellcats completing the formation. The fighter director's voice came through Sullivan's headset. All fighters proceed to Station Charlie. Angels, 15,000. Vector 270. Stand by for bogey information. They climbed to 15,000 feet and turned west. Below, the Pacific stretched endlessly. Somewhere in that blue emptiness, Japanese aircraft were approaching. Sullivan's radar could not see them yet, but the fleet's radar could. The fighter directors knew exactly where the enemy was. They would vector the Hellcats to perfect intercept positions. Sullivan checked his guns. 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. 400 rounds per gun. 2,400 rounds total. Enough to destroy a dozen enemy aircraft if he aimed properly. If he did not panic. if he remembered his training. Minutes passed. The radio remained quiet except for position updates. Sullivan's breathing sounded loud in his oxygen mask. His heart hammered. He forced himself to scan the sky. Check 6 o'clock. Check above. Check below. Watch for sun glare. Stay alert. Stay alive. Contacts bearing 265. The fighter director transmitted. Range 100 miles. Angels 1-8000. Multiple bogeys. All fighters vector 265 for intercept. WWII banked west. Sullivan stayed glued to his wing. The formation climbed toward 18,000 feet. They had altitude advantage. They had position advantage. They had the sun behind them. Everything favored the Americans. Range 70 miles, the fighter director updated. Bogies maintaining course. No fighter escort visible. That surprised Sullivan. No escorts. The Japanese were sending bombers against American carriers without fighter protection. That seemed impossible. But the radar showed what the radar showed. Range 50 miles. Sullivan's hands tightened on the stick. 50 miles was 10 minutes at the speeds they were flying. 10 minutes until combat. 10 minutes until everything he had trained for became real. He thought about Iowa, about his father and mother and sisters, about the farm, about corn growing in fields under a different sun, about a life that seemed impossibly distant from this cockpit over this ocean waiting to kill or be killed. Range 30 miles. Visual contact of WWII transmitted. Sullivan looked where his leader was looking. At first he saw nothing. Then he saw them, small dots against the horizon, growing larger, 18 aircraft in formation, bombers, Judy dive bombers, no zeros visible anywhere. The Japanese had made a terrible mistake. They had sent their strike force ahead without adequate fighter protection. They had assumed American combat air patrol would be thin and poorly positioned. They had assumed wrong. All units, Vrashu's voice came calm and professional. Weapons hot. Attack in 60 seconds. Jimmy, stay on my wing. Watch your 6. Here we go. Sullivan flipped the safety cover off his gun trigger. His finger rested on the firing button. The bombers grew larger in his windscreen. He could see their shapes now. Twin-engine aircraft. Bomb-laden. Vulnerable. Vrashu positioned his division 2,000 feet above and behind the Japanese formation. Perfect attack geometry. Altitude advantage. Sun position advantage. The enemy had not seen them yet. The Americans were invisible until the moment they struck. Vrashu rolled inverted and pulled through into a 70-degree dive. Sullivan followed without thinking. Training took over. His aircraft accelerated. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The airspeed indicator needle climbed. The bomber formation rushed closer. Vrashu fired at 300 yards. Tracers arced across the sky. The lead bomber's engine exploded in orange flame and black smoke. The aircraft nosed over and fell. Sullivan selected his own target, a Judy in the rear of the formation. He centered it in his gun sight. The range closed. 300 yards. 250. His finger tightened on the trigger. Fire, he heard Vrashu's voice in his memory. Short bursts. Do not waste ammunition. Sullivan pressed the trigger. All 6 guns fired simultaneously. The Hellcat shuddered. Tracers reached out and touched the enemy bomber. Pieces flew off its wing. Smoke poured from its engine. The aircraft rolled left and fell away burning. I got him, Sullivan screamed into his radio. I got him. Good kill, Vrashu transmitted. Now get back up here before a 0 bounces you. Sullivan pulled out of his dive and climbed. His heart hammered. His hands shook. He had just killed a man. Maybe 2 men. The bomber crew. They were dead and he was alive, and it felt nothing like he had imagined. No glory, no triumph, just shock and adrenaline and the overwhelming need to survive. He rejoined on Vrashu's wing. The sky around them filled with burning aircraft and falling debris. Other Hellcats were tearing through the Japanese formation. Bombers scattered in every direction. Some jettisoned their bombs early and dived for the ocean. Others tried to maintain formation. All of them died. Sullivan counted 8 splashes in 3 minutes. 8 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The ocean below filled with burning wreckage and oil slicks. He saw no parachutes. The bomber crews were going down with their aircraft. Below them, the American fleet steamed onward. Not one Japanese bomb had struck a ship. Not one bomber had penetrated the fighter screen. The integrated defense system had worked exactly as designed. The engagement lasted 22 minutes from first contact to last kill. 41 Japanese aircraft destroyed. 0 American losses. The mathematics of air combat had inverted completely since 1942. Sullivan landed back aboard Lexington with his hands still shaking. He climbed out of his cockpit on legs that barely supported him. Other pilots mobbed around Vrashu, congratulating him on 6 kills in one mission. Sullivan had gotten one. Just one. But he was alive. He had survived his first combat. Vrashu found him sitting on the deck beside his aircraft. "You did good up there, Jimmy. I was terrified," Sullivan admitted. "Everyone," as Vrashu said. "The difference between the living and the dead is who functions through the fear and who freezes. You functioned. You followed orders. You got a kill. That makes you a fighter pilot now." Sullivan looked at his hands. They had stopped shaking. He had done it. He had flown combat. He had killed the enemy. He had survived. His father would be proud. What he did not know was that this was just the beginning. The Japanese were preparing a second wave, and a third, and a fourth. Before the sun set on June 19, 1944, Sullivan would become a veteran many times over. But for now, in this moment, he was simply alive. And that was enough. 300 miles to the west aboard the carrier Zuikaku flight, Petty Officer Takeshi Yamada prepared for his second launch of the day. 20 years old, 6 months of training. This would be his 8th combat mission, his first against the American fleet. The ready room felt empty. 8 chairs sat vacant where pilots should have been sitting. The first wave had launched an hour ago. Fewer than half had returned. The survivors spoke in whispers. Heavy opposition, they said. Many fighters, very organized, not like intelligence briefed. Yamada tried not to think about the empty chairs. He focused on his pre-flight checklist. Check control surfaces. Check fuel quantity. Check armament. The Yokosuka D-4Y Judy bomber felt solid beneath his hands. Reliable. The mechanics had assured him this aircraft was ready for combat. He pulled a letter from his flight suit pocket. His mother's photograph smiled at him from the creased paper. His younger sister Akiko stood beside their mother. 12 years old, she wanted to be a teacher. Yamada had promised to come home and help her study for entrance examinations. He folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket, against his heart, where his mother would ride with him into battle. A veteran pilot sat down beside him. 35 years old, Pearl Harbor survivor, one of the few remaining from the original carrier's air groups that had opened the war. The man's face showed the strain of 3 years of combat. "We are losing, are we not?" the veteran asked quietly in Japanese. Yamada looked at him. Saying such things could be considered defeatist, dangerous. But the empty chairs told their own story. Yamada whispered. "Yes." The veteran nodded slowly. "Then we die with honor." "Is there honor in dying for a lie?" Yamada asked. The veteran had no answer. He simply stood and walked toward the flight deck. Yamada followed. What choice did either of them have? Orders were orders. Duty was duty. The code demanded they fly, so they would fly. On the flight deck, the second wave prepared for launch. 130 aircraft, bombers, torpedo planes, some Zero fighters for escort, everything Zuikaku and the other carriers could put into the air. Vice Admiral Ozawa had ordered maximum effort. The Americans must be hurt. Their defenses must be weakened. Press the attack regardless of losses from the first wave. Yamada climbed into his cockpit. The mechanics wished him good fortune. He started his engine and ran through his checks. The Judy responded properly to all inputs. The aircraft was ready even if Yamada was not. The launch officer's flag dropped. Aircraft began rolling down the deck and into the air. Yamada's turn came. He pushed his throttle forward. The bomber accelerated. The deck rushed past. The bow came closer. Then the aircraft lifted and climbed into tropical sky. The formation took shape slowly, too slowly. Aircraft from different carriers tried to join up. Some squadrons could not find their assigned positions. The tight, disciplined formations that had characterized Japanese carrier aviation in 1941 and 42 no longer existed. These were replacement pilots with minimal training, flying aircraft that maintenance could barely keep operational. They formed a loose gaggle rather than a proper strike formation. Yamada looked at the chaos around him and knew this would not end well. Aboard the American carrier, Essex Commander David McCampbell received the alert at 11:07 hours. Second wave inbound, 130 aircraft, larger than the first. Ozawa was committing everything. McCampbell was 34 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards. He had watched Pearl Harbor burn. He had flown combat at Marcus Island and Wake. He knew what organized Japanese formations looked like. He knew their tactics, their discipline, their precision. He also knew when that precision was absent. The fighter director vectored McCampbell's division to intercept position 50 miles ahead of the fleet, even farther out than the first wave. The Americans were pushing their defensive perimeter outward, making the Japanese run a gauntlet before they could even see the carriers. McCampbell climbed to 20,000 feet with his division. 12 Hellcats total. More fighters were being vectored from other carriers. The sky would soon fill with American aircraft, all coordinated by radar and radio, into an integrated killing machine. Contacts bearing 270, the fighter director transmitted. Range 40 miles. Angels, 15,000. Multiple bogies. Formation appears disorganized. McCampbell smiled coldly. Disorganized meant easy kills. It meant the Japanese training pipeline was failing. It meant 2 years of attrition had depleted their experienced pilots and replacements could not maintain combat effectiveness. It meant America was winning the long game. All units, McCampbell transmitted. Maintain altitude advantage. We will attack from above and behind. Boom and zoom only. No turning with escorts. Make your attacks count. At 30 miles, McCampbell spotted them. The largest formation he had seen since Midway. But unlike Midway, this formation had no cohesion. Aircraft stacked at different altitudes. Bombers mixed with torpedo planes mixed with fighters. No tactical organization. They had launched in a rush and never properly formed up. They were a mob, not a strike force. McCampbell positioned his division 3,000 feet above the highest Japanese aircraft. He rolled inverted and pulled into a steep diving attack. His wingman followed perfectly. The other two plane elements spread to attack different parts of the formation. The mathematics were brutal. 12 American fighters attacking 130 Japanese aircraft should have been suicide. But the Americans had speed. They had altitude. They had coordinated tactics. They had aircraft that could take punishment and keep flying. The Japanese had numbers. That was all. McCampbell selected a 0 at the top of the formation. The fighter was climbing, trying to gain altitude to protect the bombers below. It would never make it. McCampbell's Hellcat accelerated past 400 miles per hour in the dive. He fired a 2-second burst from 400 yards. The Zero's canopy shattered. The aircraft snap rolled left and fell away, trailing smoke and pieces of airframe. McCampbell did not watch it fall. He was already pulling out of his dive, using his speed to climb back above the formation. Already selecting his next target, his wingman destroyed a second 0 with a single burst. The Japanese pilot tried to turn with the Hellcat. Fatal mistake. The turn bled energy. The Hellcat did not turn with him. It climbed away and came back from a different angle with even more speed. The second 0 died in flames. Around McCampbell, the sky filled with American fighters. Hellcats from 6 different carriers converging on the Japanese formation. The fighter directors were reading the battle in real time, calling out priorities, directing fresh divisions toward unengaged targets, ensuring no Japanese aircraft slipped through the screen. The result was systematic slaughter. Japanese bombers tried to maintain formation, but their training was inadequate for combat stress. When Hellcats attacked from above, the bombers broke in all directions. Every break destroyed the formation's defensive cohesion. Isolated aircraft became easy targets. McCampbell destroyed a Judy dive bomber with a 3-second burst. The bomber's wing folded. It spun into the ocean. He climbed back to altitude and found a torpedo plane attempting to escape at low level. He dove, fired. The torpedo plane exploded. His radio filled with kill calls. Splash 1, 2 valves going down. Got him. Breaking off, climbing back up. The systematic execution of Japanese naval aviation played out in radio transmissions. McCampbell's division alone destroyed 11 aircraft in the first 10 minutes. Other divisions were matching or exceeding that total. The ocean below filled with burning wreckage and oil slicks. Aboard Lexington, Alexander Vrassiou launched for his second sortie of the day. Sullivan flew on his wing again. The kid had survived his first combat. That made him a veteran, relatively speaking. The fighter director vectored them toward a formation of Nakajima B-6N JIL torpedo bombers, trying to approach the fleet at wave-top height. 6 aircraft, skimming 200 feet above the ocean, trying to slip under the high-altitude fighter screen. It would not work. The radar saw them. The fighter directors tracked them. Hellcats were already being vectored down to intercept. Vrashu rolled inverted and dove straight down from 15,000 feet. Sullivan followed. The Hellcats accelerated through terminal velocity. The ocean rushed closer. The torpedo bombers grew larger in Vrashu's gun sight. The Japanese rear gunners saw them coming and opened fire. Tracers arced upward. Vrashu fired a burst at the lead JIL, damaging its engine, forcing it to break formation. Jimmy, 3 bandits breaking left. They're yours. Sullivan closed on the fleeing JILs. His training took over. Lead the target, short burst. The first JIL's fuselage erupted in flames. It exploded and scattered across the ocean's surface. Sullivan pulled hard right and selected a second target. Another burst. Another kill. The torpedo bomber cartwheeled across the water and disintegrated. He engaged the third JIL. The Japanese pilot jinked desperately, but Sullivan's Hellcat was 50 miles per hour faster even at sea level. Sullivan closed to 200 yards. His training took over. Lead the target. Short burst. 60 rounds. The JIL's left engine disintegrated. The aircraft nosed into the ocean at 180 miles per hour. Sullivan's voice came over the radio, high-pitched, excited. That is 3, Mr. Vrashu. 3 kills today. Good kill, Vrashu transmitted. Now check your 6 and climb back up. This fight is not over. They climbed back to altitude together. Below them, the ocean was littered with burning Japanese aircraft. The second wave was being destroyed even more completely than the first. 98 aircraft would be shot down. 32 would struggle back to their carriers damaged and low on fuel. Several would crash, attempting to land. The exchange ratio was catastrophic. 15 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American loss. But the day was far from over. 300 miles to the west, Vice Admiral Ozawa stood on Taiho's bridge reading loss reports. First wave, 41 aircraft missing. Second wave, 98 aircraft missing. Over 140 aircraft gone. Over 140 pilots dead or missing in just 3 hours of combat. His operations officer spoke quietly. Admiral, perhaps we should reconsider Operation A-Go. The losses are severe. The Americans clearly have more carriers than intelligence indicated. Ozawa stared at the plotting board where his planned victory should have been taking shape. Instead, the board showed disaster. But withdrawal meant abandoning Saipan. It meant admitting defeat. It meant losing the Marianas. If Japan lost the Marianas, American bombers would reach the home islands. The war would be lost. Everything depended on pressing the attack. Everything depended on believing that American defenses must be weakening, must be running low on ammunition, must be unable to sustain this level of combat. Prepare the third wave, Ozawa ordered. 47 aircraft. Everything we have left that is combat ready. They launch at 1300 hours. But sir, the operations officer protested. That is an order, Ozawa said. The operations officer bowed and moved to execute the command. Ozawa remained at the plotting board, alone with his thoughts, alone with the growing realization that something had gone terribly wrong. The Americans were not supposed to be this strong, not supposed to be this organized, not supposed to destroy Japanese strike forces with such ease. Either intelligence was catastrophically wrong, or the Americans had changed everything about how they fought carrier battles. Ozawa suspected both were true. His suspicions would be confirmed in the worst possible way. At 12:30 hours, a lookout spotted torpedo wakes approaching Taiho from the starboard bow. Submarine attack. The carrier's captain ordered emergency turn to port, but the massive ship could not maneuver fast enough. One torpedo struck Taiho forward of the island superstructure. The explosion sent a shudder through the entire ship. Damage control parties rushed to the impact point. Initial reports indicated the damage was manageable. One hit, forward of the aviation fuel tanks. The carrier could maintain speed and continue flight operations. Ozawa ordered recovery operations to continue. The third wave would launch on schedule. One torpedo would not stop Operation A-Go. What Ozawa did not know was that the torpedo had ruptured fuel lines throughout the forward section of the ship. Aviation gasoline vapor began leaking into sealed compartments. The ventilation systems spread the volatile fumes through multiple decks. Vapor concentrations rose to explosive levels. The ship's engineers reported smelling fuel everywhere, but Ozawa was focused on the battle. Seal off the affected areas, he ordered. Maintain ventilation. Continue operations. It was exactly the wrong order. The ventilation systems spread the vapors farther. The sealed compartments trapped them. Taiho was becoming a floating bomb. 7 hours later, it would explode. But for now, Ozawa believed his flagship was damaged but operational. He did not know he was standing on his own funeral pyre. Beneath the Pacific, the submarine USS Albacore turned away from Taiho at flank speed. Her captain had fired 6 torpedoes. 1 had hit. That was enough. The submarine dove deep to evade the inevitable depth charge attack from Japanese destroyers. The destroyer attack never came. The Japanese were too focused on the air battle to properly prosecute a submarine contact. Albacore escaped unscathed. Her captain would not know until after the war that his single torpedo hit had doomed one of Japan's finest carriers. The third Japanese wave launched at 1300 hours, 47 aircraft. Ozawa's final operational reserves. Everything left. They flew east toward coordinates where Ozawa believed the American carriers were operating. The coordinates were wrong. Spruance had maneuvered his task force northwest during the afternoon. The Japanese strike force flew past the American fleet in the wrong direction. They circled for 30 minutes searching. Found empty ocean. Their fuel ran low. The strike leader made a decision. Fly to Guam, land, refuel, rearm, try again. It was a reasonable decision. It was also fatal. American radar tracked the Japanese aircraft to Guam. Fighter directors vectored Hellcats to follow them. When the Japanese approached Guam's airfields with landing gear down and flaps extended, American fighters attacked from above. Takeshi Yamada was in that formation. He had somehow survived the second wave. His aircraft was damaged. His fuel was nearly exhausted. He could see Guam's runway ahead. Safety. He dropped his landing gear and began his approach. Then tracers came from above. Yamada's engine took multiple hits. Oil sprayed across his windscreen. The engine seized. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Yamada tried to pull up, tried to gain altitude to bail out. But he was too low, too slow. The damaged Judy nosed over and spun into the jungle 200 meters short of the runway. The impact killed him instantly. His mother's letter remained in his pocket over his heart. It would be found 3 weeks later by American Marines clearing the crash site. The letter would be forwarded through the Red Cross. It would reach Yamada's mother in Yokohama in 1946. She would keep it on the family altar for 50 years. Alexander Vrashu watched the Judy crash into the jungle. He felt no triumph, just another dead kid. Just another young pilot who believed what his leaders told him and died for those beliefs. Splash when Vrashu reported. His voice was flat, tired. "That makes 19 for you," Sir Sullivan transmitted. "You are an ace 5 times over." "Yeah," Vrashu said. He turned his Hellcat back toward the fleet, toward Lexington, toward another landing and another debrief and eventually another mission. The day was not over. The Japanese still had carriers afloat. The battle would continue. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japanese naval aviation had been destroyed, not gradually, not through attrition over months. Destroyed in 8 hours off the Mariana Islands. Of the 47 aircraft in the third wave, only 10 would eventually rejoin the Japanese fleet. The rest were destroyed at Guam or scattered to other islands or lost to fuel exhaustion over the Pacific. Operation A-Go had failed. Completely, catastrophically, irreversibly. And the worst was yet to come. At 15:32 hours, 7 hours after the torpedo hit, accumulated gasoline vapors in Taiho's sealed compartments reached critical concentration. A spark from unknown origin ignited the fumes. The explosion that followed was catastrophic. It originated deep in the ship, a massive detonation that tore Taiho apart from the inside. The flight deck buckled upward. Aircraft parked on deck launched into the air from the blast force. Their wings tore off. Men on the bridge were thrown like toys. Ozawa struggled to his feet. Damage control, he shouted. Report. The ship is breaking apart, an officer screamed. We must abandon ship. Secondary explosions rippled through Taiho. Fire spread. The carrier listed heavily to starboard. Ozawa knew. His flagship was dying. The pride of the mobile fleet. The most advanced carrier in the Japanese Navy. Destroyed not by American bombs, but by a single torpedo 7 hours earlier. All hands abandon ship, Ozawa ordered. Sailors jumped into the burning ocean. Destroyers attempted rescue, but the oil fires made approach difficult. Taiho's bow rose. The massive ship slid backward beneath the waves. 1,650 men died. Ozawa transferred to the cruiser Haguro and watched his flagship disappear. He stood on Haguro's deck soaking wet, defeated, broken. Around him, his staff tried to assess the situation. 3 strike waves launched, over 300 aircraft, fewer than 100 returned. Taiho gone. The carrier Shikaku had been sunk by another submarine earlier in the day. 1,600 men lost there as well. The mobile fleet still had 7 carriers, but they carried fewer than 100 operational aircraft total. Not enough to challenge American air superiority, not enough to protect the fleet from American counterattack, not enough to continue Operation Ago. The battle was lost. Saipan was lost. The Marianas were lost. The path to Japan lay open. Ozawa composed a message to combined fleet headquarters. Heavy losses sustained. Fleet repositioning for follow-on operations. It was code for retreat. Everyone knew it. But the code preserved honor, preserved face, allowed the fiction that this was tactical repositioning rather than catastrophic defeat. The operations officer approached Ozawa carefully. Admiral, the Americans will pursue. Let them come, Ozawa said quietly. We have nothing left to fight them with. The sun began setting over the Philippine Sea. June 19, 1944 was ending. The day Japanese naval aviation died. The day American adaptation and Japanese assumption met in combat, and the result was never in doubt. But the Americans were not finished. Admiral Spruance had a decision to make. Pursue the retreating Japanese carriers and risk his own aircraft, or let them escape and preserve his forces. Spruance chose to pursue. The final act of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was about to begin, and it would be written in fire across the sunset sky. June 20th, 1944. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea. The American task force had spent the night pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet. Ozawa's carriers fled northwest at maximum speed, trying to escape, trying to preserve what little remained of the mobile fleet. Aboard his flagship, Admiral Raymond Spruance studied the latest contact reports. The Japanese carriers were 275 miles away, beyond normal strike range. Most carrier aircraft could reach that distance, but few would have enough fuel to return. Spruance's staff gathered in the flag plot. The debate had been ongoing since midnight. Conservative officers argued for caution. The mission was to protect the Saipan invasion. That mission was accomplished. The Japanese threat was neutralized. Why risk aircraft and pilots chasing a defeated enemy? The aggressive officers argued for annihilation. The Japanese carriers still floated. They could be repaired, rearmed, returned to combat in months. If they escaped now, more Americans would die later. Finish them now while they were vulnerable. Spruance listened to both arguments. He was 57 years old, methodical, careful, not given to reckless gestures. But he understood strategic mathematics. Every Japanese carrier that survived today was a carrier that could kill Americans tomorrow. He made his decision. We strike, Spruance said. Maximum range, all available aircraft, launch at 1600 hours. Admiral, a staff officer, protested, half our pilots will not have fuel to return. Spruance looked at him. Then we will bring them home another way. Prepare the strike. The officer saluted and moved to execute the order. Spruance turned to his operations officer. When our aircraft return tonight, I want every ship in this task force lit up like a Christmas tree. Searchlights, truck lights, running lights, everything. We are going to light a path home. Submarines could see us. They can sink ships, Spruance said quietly. I will not lose pilots to darkness. Word spread through the fleet. Maximum range strike. Voluntary basis. Pilots who flew this mission might not come back. They would be attacking enemy carriers 275 miles away with barely enough fuel for the round trip. No margin for combat, no reserve for bad weather, no safety net. Every pilot volunteered. Aboard Lexington, Alexander Vrashu climbed into his Hellcat for the fourth sortie in 2 days. 3 times yesterday on June 19th, now one more on the 20th. His body ached, his eyes burned from fatigue. He had flown 3 combat sorties on June 19th, destroyed 6 enemy aircraft, watched Jimmy Sullivan transform from terrified farm kid into combat pilot. Now Spruance was asking for one more mission, the dangerous one, the mission that might not end with a landing back aboard Lexington. Vrashu calculated the fuel numbers in his head: 275 miles to target, 275 miles back, combat reserve, margin for error. The mathematics did not work. Not enough fuel, not unless everything went perfectly. But perfect was a fantasy in war. Something always went wrong. Sullivan approached him on the flight deck. The kid looked exhausted too. 2 kills yesterday, 1 more this morning on an early combat air patrol. He was a veteran now by any measure. Mr. Vrashu, Sullivan said, "We are not coming back from this one, are we?" Vrashu looked at him. He could lie, could offer false reassurance. But Sullivan deserved the truth. "Maybe not all of us," Vrashu said. "You want to sit this one out, nobody would blame you." Sullivan shook his head. "Hell no, sir. I did not come this far to miss the finale." Vrashu grinned despite his fatigue. "That is my wingman." They climbed into their aircraft. Around them, 216 aircraft prepared for launch. Hellcats, Dauntless dive bombers, Avenger torpedo planes. The largest strike the task force had assembled. Every carrier was contributing. Every air group was committed. At 16:24 hours, the launch began. Aircraft rolled down flight decks and into the afternoon air. They formed up by squadrons, by air groups. The massive formation turned west and flew into the dying sun. The ocean below turned from blue to gold to crimson as the sun descended toward the horizon. Fuel gauges began their inexorable march toward empty. Pilots wrote on their knee pads, coordinates for rescue, final messages to families. Some prayed. Some sang quietly to themselves over the radio. All of them flew west, knowing they might never see their carriers again. Commander David McCampbell led Air Group 15 from Essex. He flew in the lead Hellcat. Behind him stretched the entire strike force, the largest formation he had led since training exercises. But this was no exercise. This was the final hunt. At 1800 hours, the strike force spotted smoke on the horizon. The Japanese fleet, 6 carriers scattered across 20 miles of ocean, destroyers and cruisers surrounding them, anti-aircraft guns ready, combat air patrol overhead. The Japanese knew the Americans were coming. They had been tracking the strike force on radar for 30 minutes. They were as ready as their depleted forces allowed. It would not be enough. All units, McCampbell transmitted. "This is it. We are 275 miles from home and running on fumes. Make every bomb count. Make every torpedo count. We finished them today." The dive bombers rolled in first. They came from 18,000 feet, screaming down at terminal velocity. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts. Some American aircraft took hits. Pieces flew off wings. Engines streamed smoke. But the dive bombers kept coming. The primary target was the carrier Hio, a fleet carrier, 30,000 tons, one of the few remaining major units of the mobile fleet. The dive bombers focused their attack with professional precision. 2,000-pound bombs fell away from Dauntless dive bombers. The weapons fell for 7 seconds, long enough for bombardiers to track their trajectories, long enough to pray. The first bomb hit Hio amidships. The explosion tore through the flight deck and detonated in the hangar. Aircraft parked below erupted in flames. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship. The second bomb hit aft. It penetrated to the engineering spaces and exploded among the boilers. Hio lost power. The carrier slowed and began listing. Avenger torpedo bombers came in low from multiple angles. The Japanese destroyer screen threw up walls of anti-aircraft fire, but the Avengers pressed through. Torpedoes dropped at 200 feet altitude. They hit the water. Their engines drove them toward Hio. One torpedo struck the carrier's starboard side. The underwater explosion buckled hull plates. Water rushed into ruptured compartments. HEO's list increased. Damage control parties fought the fires, pumped water from flooded compartments, tried to save their ship, but the damage was too severe. Too many hits, too much fire. At 1918 hours, HEO's magazines detonated. The massive explosion broke the carrier's back. The ship broke in half. Both sections rolled over and sank within 4 minutes. 1,200 men died. Some jumped into burning oil. Others went down with the ship. Japanese destroyers attempted rescue, but the oil fires and debris field made approach nearly impossible. Alexander Vrachu circled above the sinking carrier, providing fighter cover for the dive bombers and torpedo planes. He engaged 2 Japanese Zeros attempting to intercept the strike force. Both died quickly. Vrachu was too experienced, too skilled, too tired to play games with enemy fighters. He destroyed both Zeros with minimal ammunition expenditure. Professional execution. No wasted effort. Then he checked his fuel gauge and his heart sank. The needle showed nearly empty. The combat had consumed fuel he did not have. The return flight was 275 miles. His fuel would last maybe 200. Sullivan Vrachu transmitted, "Fuel check." "Nearly empty," Sir Sullivan replied. His voice shook slightly. "I do not think I can make it back." Vrachu looked at his own gauge again. Ran the calculations. Neither of them would make the carriers, not both. Maybe one if they climbed to altitude and leaned the mixture to absolute minimum. Maybe. "Stay close," Vrachu told Sullivan. "We will figure something out." The strike force turned east, toward home, toward carriers that were 275 miles away. The sun touched the horizon and began sinking. Darkness came fast in the tropics. Within an hour, full night would blanket the Pacific. Radio transmissions filled the air, pilots reporting fuel states, calculating ranges, making decisions about when to ditch and where. "Fuel critical," one pilot transmitted. "Going down near the destroyers. Request pickup." "Roger," the carrier replied. "Destroyers are standing by." "My engine just quit," another pilot called. Ditching now, position report received. "Help is coming." One by one, aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched into the Pacific. Some pilots landed near destroyers and were rescued immediately. Others landed in open ocean and inflated life rafts. They would drift through the night, hoping rescue would find them at dawn. Sullivan's engine began sputtering at 2000 hours. 30 minutes from the fleet, still too far. His fuel had run out. Mr. Vrachu, Sullivan transmitted. "My engine is dying. I have to ditch." Vrachu looked at his own fuel gauge, also nearly empty, but maybe enough. Maybe. If he ditched with Sullivan, they would both be in the water. If he stayed airborne, he could mark Sullivan's position and vector rescue. "How far to the fleet?" Vrachu asked. 5 miles, Sullivan said. "Not going to make it." "You ditch near a destroyer," Vrachu said. "They will pick you up. You will be okay." Sullivan's voice cracked. "It has been an honor, sir. Tell my folks I did my duty." "You will tell them yourself," Vrachu said, "when you get back to Iowa after the war. Now ditch that bird and get in your raft. That is an order." Sullivan's engine quit completely. The Hellcat became a glider. Sullivan found a destroyer below with searchlights sweeping the ocean. He aimed for the lit area. His aircraft descended. He set up for water landing. Gear up, flaps down, tail low. The Hellcat hit the water hard. The impact threw Sullivan forward into his harness. Water sprayed over the canopy. The aircraft floated for maybe 30 seconds. Sullivan popped the canopy and climbed out onto the wing. The Hellcat was sinking. He jumped clear and inflated his life vest. The aircraft slid beneath the surface. Gone. Sullivan floated in the Pacific at night. Above him, he could hear Vrachu's engine. Still running. Barely. The destroyer's searchlight found him. The bright beam locked onto his position. "Over here," Sullivan yelled and waved. "Over here." The destroyer turned toward him. Sailors threw lines. Sullivan grabbed one and they pulled him aboard. He collapsed on the deck, coughing salt water. Alive. Exhausted. Terrified. But alive. Above the destroyer, Vrachu circled once. He saw Sullivan get pulled from the water. The kid was safe. That was what mattered. Bob Henderson had died and Vrachu could not save him. But Jimmy Sullivan lived. The promise was kept. Vrachu turned east toward Lexington. His fuel gauge read empty. The engine sputtered once, twice. Keep running, Vrachu whispered. Just a little farther. Ahead, the night ocean suddenly blazed with light. Every ship in Task Force 58 had turned on every light. Searchlights swept the sky. Truck lights illuminated flight decks. Running lights marked the formation boundaries. The entire fleet had become a brilliant constellation against the darkness. Spruance had kept his promise. He was lighting the way home. Vrachu's engine coughed again. The propeller windmilled slower. The fuel was gone. But Lexington's flight deck blazed ahead. Maybe 2 miles. Maybe close enough. His engine quit. The Hellcat became a glider. Vrachu trimmed for best glide speed, aimed for the carrier. The aircraft descended. 1,000 feet. 500 feet. The deck came closer. Too low. Not going to make it. Vrachu prepared to ditch alongside the carrier. Then an updraft from Lexington's island superstructure lifted his aircraft slightly. Just enough. The Hellcat crossed the ramp. The hook snagged the number 3 wire. The aircraft stopped. Vrachu sat in the cockpit for a long moment. He could not move, could not think. His hands shook. His whole body shook. He had just flown over 450 miles on force that should have lasted 300. He had destroyed 2 more enemy aircraft. He had watched Sullivan ditch and get rescued. He had glided the final 2 miles on a dead engine. He climbed out of the cockpit. His legs barely supported him. Deck crew helped him down. Someone handed him coffee. He drank it and tasted nothing. How many came back, he asked. Still counting, sir, a deck officer said. Maybe 60%. A lot of them ditched. Destroyers are picking them up. 60% meant 40% were in the water or worse. 80 aircraft lost. Maybe 100. But Hiyo was sunk. The Japanese carriers were destroyed. The mobile fleet was finished. The mathematics were brutal, but necessary. Spruance had made the hard choice. Sacrifice some to save many later. Win the war by accepting losses today that prevented greater losses tomorrow. Vrachu walked to his quarters, fell onto his bunk, slept without dreaming. June 21st, 1944. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea. Destroyers continued searching for downed pilots. They had worked through the night, searchlights sweeping the ocean, finding life rafts, pulling exhausted pilots from the water. Jimmy Sullivan returned to Lexington at 0800 hours. Transferred from the destroyer that rescued him. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. But he was alive. He was whole. He had survived. Vrachu found him in the ready room. The kid sat alone staring at nothing. You did good out there, Vrachu said. Sullivan looked at him. You stayed overhead until you saw the destroyer get me. Told you I would drag you home, Vrachu said. Sullivan nodded slowly. Thank you, sir, for everything, for teaching me, for keeping me out, for not leaving me. Vrachu sat beside him. That is what wingmen do. We bring each other home. They sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the squadron counted their losses. 3 pilots had not returned. 2 were confirmed rescued. 1 was still missing. The empty chairs told their own story. Final accounting came that afternoon. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was over. The numbers told a story of complete American dominance and catastrophic Japanese defeat. American losses for both days. 123 aircraft. 76 aircrew killed or missing. Most losses came from fuel exhaustion on the long-range strike of June 20th. Only 43 aircraft were lost to enemy action. Japanese losses staggered belief. 3 fleet carriers sunk. Taiho, Shokaku, Hiyo. 4 carriers damaged. Over 600 aircraft destroyed, including land-based aircraft from Guam. 445 trained pilots killed. Pilots who had required 2 years of training. Pilots who could never be replaced. The mobile fleet still existed on paper. 7 carriers remained afloat, but they carried fewer than 100 operational aircraft total. Not enough to challenge American air superiority. Not enough to defend themselves. Not enough to matter. Japanese naval aviation had been destroyed as an offensive force. From June 19th forward, American carriers would operate with near impunity across the Pacific. The remaining Japanese carriers would sortie one final time in October at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Not to fight. To serve as decoys while battleships attempted a suicide attack on invasion beaches. The Americans would sink 4 more carriers that day. Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda. the last major action of Japanese carrier aviation in World War II. But the consequences of the Marianas battle extended far beyond carrier aviation. The Marianas fell to American forces over the following months. Saipan was secured by July 9th, Tinian by August 1st, Guam by August 10th. Construction battalions immediately began building airfields capable of handling B-29 Superfortress bombers. By November 1944, American bombers began striking the Japanese home islands from Marianas bases. The islands Ozawa had sacrificed his fleet trying to defend became the platforms for Japan's destruction. Everything that followed became possible because of what happened on June 19th and 20th. The firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all launched from the Marianas. Vice Admiral Ozawa survived the war. In post-war interviews, he acknowledged the Marianas' defeat with painful honesty. "We could not replace the pilots," he said. "The Americans could replace everything. We lost pilots who took years to train. They were replaced with boys who had months of training, and the Americans only got better. Their technology improved. Their tactics evolved. Their pilots learned from every engagement. We learned nothing. We could not admit our failures, so we repeated them until we had nothing left." Alexander Vrechu survived the war with 19 confirmed kills. His 6 kills on June 19th remained his career best single mission. He flew at Leyte Gulf. He trained more pilots. He returned to civilian life in 1946. He married, raised a family, lived to 96 years old. He died in 2015, having spent 70 years telling the story of the great Marianas Turkey. Shoot to anyone who would listen. His message never changed. "People ask me how we won," he said in interviews. "It was not courage. The Japanese had courage too. It was preparation. We learned from every mistake. We adapted faster than they could. We built systems that kept us alive and killed them. We won because we refused to keep doing things that did not work." David McCampbell became the Navy's all-time leading ace with 34 victories. His greatest single day came not at the Marianas but at Leyte Gulf 4 months later, when he shot down 9 aircraft in one mission. He survived the war, retired as a captain. The Navy named a guided missile frigate after him. He never claimed to be special. "Just lucky and well-trained," he said. "I had a better aircraft and better training than the other guy. That made all the difference." Jimmy Sullivan returned to Iowa in 1946. He never spoke about the war except to say he had served. He took over his family's farm, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children. He never flew again. The war had given him enough sky for one lifetime, but sometimes on summer evenings, he would watch planes overhead and remember a 24-year-old lieutenant named Vrachu who had taught a scared farm kid how to survive. Sullivan died in 2003, surrounded by children and grandchildren who inherited his quiet courage, if not his war. At his funeral, his son found a letter in Sullivan's belongings, written on Lexington stationery, dated June 21st, 1944. Never sent. "Dear Mom and Dad," the letter began, "I survived. Lieutenant Vrachu kept his promise. He brought me home. I am safe. I am whole. I did my duty. I hope I made you proud. I will tell you everything when I get home. But for now, know that I am alive because someone cared enough to teach me right. Your son, Jimmy." The story of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot is not just history. It is a blueprint for American success. It shows what happens when a nation refuses to accept defeat as final, when it learns from failure faster than the enemy can exploit success, when it builds systems rather than relying on individual heroism. Look at what happened in 24 months, from May 1942 to June 1944, from the disaster of Coral Sea to the domination of the Marianas. The Americans who lost at Coral Sea were not weaker than the Americans who won at the Marianas. They were less prepared, less equipped, less trained in effective doctrine. But they learned. Every defeat was studied. Every loss was analyzed. Every survivor was debriefed. The lessons were compiled. Doctrine was rewritten. Aircraft were redesigned. Training was revolutionized. Within 2 years, American naval aviation had transformed from confused victim to systematic executioner. The Japanese learned nothing. They could not admit failure. Their culture did not permit questioning authority or challenging doctrine. So they repeated the same tactics with degraded forces against an enemy that grew stronger every month. The result was inevitable, catastrophic, complete. This is the lesson for America. Not that we are invincible. We are not. The lesson is that we are adaptable. We learn, we improve, we overcome. That is the American way. That has always been the American way. The greatest generation understood this. The men who fought at the Marianas were not born warriors. They were farmers and mechanics and factory workers. They were kids like Jimmy Sullivan who had never seen the ocean. They became the most effective fighting force in history because they were willing to learn, willing to adapt, willing to do whatever worked rather than whatever tradition demanded. If you served in the military, you know this truth. You lived it. If your father or grandfather served, they embodied it. The measure of a fighting force is not how well it wins. It is how well it learns from losing. Many of you watching have connections to this story. Your fathers flew Hellcats in the Pacific. Your uncles served on carriers. Maybe you yourself served in Korea, or Vietnam, or later conflicts. You understand what Vrashu and Sullivan and McCampbell went through. You know the fear, the exhaustion, the impossible decisions, the friends who did not come home. Share those stories in the comments. This generation is fading. Fewer than 100,000 World War II veterans remain alive today. Their stories matter. Their lessons matter. Your memories preserve their sacrifice. Hit that like button to honor the 76 American air crewmen who did not come home from the Marianas. To honor the thousands of Japanese young men who died believing lies their leaders told them. War creates casualties on both sides. We can honor courage even in those who fought against us. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories about the greatest generation. The men who taught America that learning from failure is more powerful than never failing at all. The men who proved that systematic preparation defeats individual heroism. The men who won not because they were stronger, but because they were smarter. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot stands as proof of one fundamental truth. America wins not by being perfect. America wins by learning faster than everyone else, by adapting quicker, by building better systems, by refusing to repeat failures. That lesson echoes across generations, from the Marianas to today. When we forget it, we lose. When we remember it, we are unstoppable. The empty chair in Fighting Squadron 16's ready room remained for the rest of the war. Bob Henderson's nameplate stayed attached to it. A reminder, a memorial. Alexander Vrashu would touch that chair before every mission. A ritual, a promise kept. Jimmy Sullivan watched him do it on June 22nd when they launched for another combat air patrol. He understood. Some promises transcend death. Some lessons are written in blood. Some debts can never be fully repaid. But they can be honored by remembering, by learning, by teaching the next generation what sacrifice purchased, by ensuring that those who died for American victory did not die for nothing. The sun set over the Philippine Sea on June 21st, 1944. The battle was over. The Turkey Shoot had ended. 350 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 445 pilots killed, 3 carriers sunk. The mobile fleet shattered beyond repair. But more importantly, American naval aviation had proven itself, had validated 2 years of painful learning, had demonstrated that adaptation beats tradition, that systematic preparation defeats warrior spirit, that the students had become the teachers and the final exam had been delivered in fire and death across Pacific skies. This is their story. This is their legacy. This is what the greatest generation taught America. Learn from failure. Adapt faster than the enemy. Build systems that work. Bring your people home. That is how America won World War II. That is how America wins. That is the lesson of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Remember it, honor it, pass it on. They earned that much.